Good day, my wonderful students. Today we begin our study of Africa after World War II. Independence in Africa. What you see is a map in front of you of Africa with various different colors. The different colors represent the different times that the African countries gained their independence, stopped being colonies. Now the areas that are in purple, that's the earliest one, 1949, where Egypt first became independent and Ethiopia became independent. And then you see in the 1950s, more countries became independent, and a good chunk of West Africa by 1960. And then obviously the other colors are later years. So it starts off with the African nationalists. Nationalists are, of course, people who love their country, but if their country is under the control of a foreign country, these nationalists want their people to be free to determine for themselves, self-determination, what the course of their nation will be. Remember, nation is not just a country. Nation is a group of people who share a similar history, a similar culture and background. Now, Kwame Nkrumah liberated the colony of Gold Coast using Gandhi's methods of passive resistance. Jomo Kenyatta, pictured here, liberated Kenya with violence in a group he led called Mau Mau. So, different African leaders freed their countries using different methods. Leopold Senghor was an important nationalist leader of Senegal. South Africa was a special case. It had been a Dutch colony and then later a British colony under the Napoleonic Wars. Many white settlers had immigrated to South Africa, and in 1910 they gained their independence, but they were ruled by a white minority, the descendants of earlier settlers. These people called themselves Afrikaners. So it's basically was a segregated society, much like you could compare it to the U.S. South under Jim Crow laws. Now, South Africa has large deposits of gold and diamonds. These resources and cheap black African labor that the white Afrikaners exploited fueled an industrial revolution in South Africa in the early 1900s. Now, in South Africa, the races were separated legally. This segregation was called apartheid, which means apartness. Much like the southern U.S., blacks went to inferior schools at separate benches, separate parks, separate water fountains. Here's an example of a sign where it says for use by white persons. You'll notice at the bottom it says in a different language the exact same information. This language, called Afrikaans, was the language of the white settlers, and it's related to Dutch, the earlier Dutch settlers who had settled there. Now, in addition, blacks had to carry identification papers to track their movements. So imagine if you had to carry a passport whenever you moved from one area of the state to another area, and the police could stop you and ask for your papers. This is considered a violation of the right to free movement amongst individuals in a society. Now, there was resistance to this, of course. The African National Congress, it's not actually a Congress. It doesn't pass laws or anything. It's a political group in South Africa that began resisting apartheid using Gandhi's methods of passive resistance. After police, however, in South Africa killed 69 protesters, the African National Congress turned to violence. They dropped their passive resistance and turned into violent resistance. Now, the South African government, as a result of this, arrested many of the African National Congress's leaders, including a young Nelson Mandela. As time passed, Nelson Mandela became a symbol of the movement to end apartheid. He was in prison for decades. Western nations began to protest this practice of apartheid in the 1980s, and many nations stopped trading with South Africa, which caused the South African economy to begin to collapse. So, in 1989, F.W. de Klerk, pictured here, was elected president of South Africa based on a campaign to improve the economy by sharing power with blacks. Nelson Mandela, pictured here alongside F.W. de Klerk, was released and a new constitution was written which would allow all people to vote in elections. And as a result, in 1994, Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president of South Africa. Now, since independence, many African nations have struggled to modernize. They have had difficulties due to their economies, many of which are still based around colonial practices of selling raw materials to their former mother countries. Many African nations have economies based around the export of one resource. And if your entire economy is based around selling cotton or selling cocoa beans for chocolate, then if the price of that goes down, your economy is going to go down with it. When the price of their main export falls, the economy is in trouble. Urbanization has created new problems as well. Traditional societies have weakened and slums have grown up around the cities. Here you can see a picture of an African slum. As you can see, it is not a place where you would want to live or grow up. And a lack of education and illiteracy rates, not knowing how to read or write, also harm the ability of African nations to develop. Without proper education, people cannot build new industries. People cannot make their society better, and the cycle of poverty continues. AIDS has grown to epidemic proportions in South Africa. In 2000, there were 24 million Africans estimated with AIDS, and even today, 2/3 of all AIDS victims in the entire world live in Africa. The epidemic is awful there. It is estimated that 6,000 people die every day, and the prevalence of this disease has actually caused the life expectancies of people in Africa to decline. And that is the end of this review.